All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. And today I am joined by two distinguished guests. We have here today Steven Erikson, the author of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and other books in the Malazan world, as well as books outside of the Malazan world, including Rejoice, where there was a wonderful discussion about that today on AP's channel. So welcome to our discussion. Steve, how are you today?
I'm okay. Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right.
Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. It's great
Well,
to see
you're
you.
halfway through. It's all downhill from here. So
That's right. Yeah, we are half, and this is the occasion, of course. We are halfway through our read of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. AP and I are going through all 10 books together, and we are having a really wonderful time doing it. And speak of the devil, here, my other guest is the man who blows us all away with his pyrotechnical explosive feats of literary criticism, the illuminating Dr. A.P. Canavan. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. It is the one and only Professor Fireballs.
Oh, Philip, I am never getting away from that now, am
no.
I?
I certainly hope not. But there's
It
really no
is.
need to get inflamed about it.
Oh dear God.
I'm sorry, AP. It's just that you're such a blast to tease.
You've
Well,
discovered that, have you, Philip? Yeah,
I have
absolutely.
discovered that.
Yeah.
oh, oh joy! Now I have two people to torture me for my entire life. This is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
I was gonna say I was genuinely looking forward to this. This was going to be another honor, as I love talking about these things, and you've completely ruined it. I just feel ganged up on now by you and Erikson there.
AP, are you telling me that you don't like my fire puns?
Are you mockering me?
All right, I can leave now if you like. You guys can just continue.
Yeah.
Don't worry, Steve. It was just a ruse.
Yeah.
You know, curled, we all just Leosin up a little bit here. I mean, it's just a little bit of light humor.
You've all been writing these down, haven't you? You got a whole list sitting in front of
Yes.
you.
There is an entire pun thread
Yeah.
on one of my videos.
Quite a few of them, actually. But okay, we'll stop. You won't have to warn us again.
Oh man.
See, now, Erikson, now I know how you feel when I do it to you.
Well, I'm kind of fine. I mean, I get my revenge in my next, Bocalane Corbel Broach novella. There'll be some characters showing up there who will suffer horrible fates.
Oh, oh dear. You know, I'm looking forward to reading a certain Bocalane and Corbel Broach story. AP and I, and actually Ruth and Bad are going to be reading it along with a couple others. Yep, Crackpot Trail is on the horizon.
Okay.
Yep. So I can't wait to meet Abdo Cannavalian. But I am a little curious how you like, the question that we're really all burning to hear you answer is, how do you like AP's Malazan nickname that we've given him, Professor Fireballs?
Well, I think it's quite appropriate. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, the nicknames are good. They're good.
They're good. Yeah. Professor, because he actually insists on the apostrophe in there.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, I also wanted to mention one of our viewers has taken this whole Professor Fireballs and Dr. Fantasy thing and has written some really fun short stories. His name is Paul. So if I can say it right, Paul van Dolewerd. And he has compiled these on his YouTube page. I'll put a link actually in the description below. I don't know if you've seen them yet, but they're actually quite fun. And I know you love them too, AP. So.
Well, to be honest, they're starting to rival Bocalane and Corbel Broach. I could just see this whole adventure beginning, and I'm going, oh dear God, no.
Yeah, Paul's done a brilliant job with that. So big shout out to Paul and thank you. I mean, it's the spirit of the whole Malazan community is just fantastic. And AP and I have been fortunate enough to share in that. And so our viewers really make this fun. It is a very fun community. And on a serious note, I also want to thank you, Steve, for your presence with us here today, but also in general on BookTube. And I know you're fans, and I'm certainly one of them. We really enjoy it tremendously, and what you've added to all of our videos is just so wonderful with these kinds of interviews and discussions. So thank you very much, and I'm sure all the fans would wish to join me in that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So. All right, so yes, we are at our halfway point, and I think AP and I have been having a lot of fun so far in our discussions. And you know, I actually would like to give you an opportunity before we get talking about. We're going to talk about themes in the 5 books that we've read so far. But before we get there, I would like to give you a chance to critique the critics a little bit, and I'm wondering. Just how are we doing so far? Are we doing pretty well with our read through? And is there anything that you think we could do more of, or less of, or anything you would like to see us do in the course of? Or we can even broaden that to MalazTube in general. Are there any videos you're just kind of waiting to see, that sort of thing?
No. I have to step way back on that, and just, you know, whatever people want to talk about. By all means, talk about. You know, positive, negative, it doesn't matter. I enjoy sort of engaging in conversation about, you know, various aspects of the series, of the efforts that I made and can made and continue to make. And in fact, of late, there's been some absolutely amazing videos.
Yeah,
I was really taken by, I guess over the last week, there's been, I don't know, at least a half dozen that have been just, you know, sort of discussing various aspects that normally don't sort of get highlighted.
Yeah.
And I mean, I really liked Raf's one on just the influence, or, you know, because I don't read fantasy, so I don't know. I couldn't tell you what the influence of our stuff has been on fantasy, whether there's been any influence at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, for me, it just feels like the Malazan stuff is sitting out on an island in the middle of, you know, a desolate sea. You know, it's way out there, because quite often you'll get, you know, your 10 best series or 10 best fantasy lists, and you know, Malazan's not even on them. So
it's on a lot of the ones I've seen, though. I have to say,
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it a desolate sea. Maybe it's an island, in the sense that I'm not sure anyone could imitate what you've done, what you and Ian Esselman have done. But I don't think it's a desolate sea. I think it's a beautiful turquoise, you know, wonderful place to swim and have a great time. You know, it's just a phenomenal achievement, and in the sense that no one's going to be able to imitate it, maybe, but I think there's some influence there. So I'm glad Raf is doing that too. So
yeah.
I also really appreciate the masterclass, and I'm calling it a masterclass because that's what it is that you and AP are doing every week. Usually the video comes out, I think, on Wednesdays. So that's just I have enjoyed that tremendously. Just hearing you guys get down into the fine points there.
Yeah, I think you know, it's interesting. I hadn't mentioned it to AP, but you know, this is narratology as almost a course that he is teaching.
Yeah.
And you know, instead of teaching it to, you know, 20 students, 15 students each year, the potential for a lot of people to basically take that course in narratology in fantasy, using fantasy as a genre, is huge. You know, I mean, if you think of the size of the classroom, if it's like 500-600 people, that's a lot of people in a classroom.
Yeah.
So I think that's been an amazing service, because I know AP has taught in the past, but he's not teaching now, and
Right.
you know, in a sense that's everyone's loss.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you guys are doing it, because I'm learning a lot, and I've paid for one of those master classes before, and it was good, but this is fantastic. So the two of you together discussing all those things. I've just enjoyed it thoroughly, and I know a lot of other viewers have too. So thank you both.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit unusual in that you've got somebody talking about the craft of writing while somebody else is talking about the analysis of narrative. That tends not to sort of show up in the same place. So, creative writing workshops and courses and programs tend not to be discussing the things that AP is discussing. It's just not there.
Yeah.
And I guess vice versa. So it's been cool.
One of the minor, that was very nice of both of you to say, but I don't want to mislead people. If we were doing this as a proper course, like, it would be much more structured, that we would have learning outcomes and we'd have all things that you could work through. So, this is not me pretending that this is what an actual course would look like. But one of the big advantages that at least I hope that people can see is, if you're interested in the process of writing, Steve is going through a section of something he has written, or something he has published. And we talk very specifically about aspects that he put into that. But unlike a creative writing course, sometimes I think creative writers are focused so much on the craft that there's a disconnect between what your audience is actually receiving. And so just bringing in that from my angle as a sort of professional reader, like I get paid. But it adds to the experience, because we know at university, we know in all of these courses, we have a tendency to fragment everything, to concentrate on little tiny aspects and go, this is the skill that we're trying to teach. And we forget that none of these things are isolated. They all work in conjunction with everything else. Like, no man is an island unto himself. That the creative writing endeavor, if someone just wants to write for themselves, write it, put it on a shelf, and there you go. But if you're interested in the techniques and how a reader receives them, I think it is an interesting way to approach it, because coming from the two different angles, we usually end up in the same place, but we see the different ways and the different approaches that you can use to get there. So it's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, I can see that. It's also great so you guys are doing kind of deep dives into very specific passages, but at the same time, what you say about those passages applies to so much of the books. So there are themes in there that are spread throughout all 10 books. So it's just kind of fun to see them very specifically in a certain passage, and to have you guys sort of mine that passage for everything it's worth. It's very, very fun. So speaking of themes and all that, the main topic for today is going to be, well, first, actually, I'd like to get Steve, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about how do you incorporate themes into your writing? And do you, for example, think about, okay, these are the themes I'm going to put in there, and you plan it all out? Or is it on the other end where you're just writing it organically, and during the creative process, the themes kind of emerge? Or is it some combination thereof? What exactly do you do? Because I would think that one of the dangers would be to sort of hammer the reader over the head with, here's my theme, you want to make a really deep, kind of book. So it would be, I could very easily see myself sort of clumsily handling that and hitting a little too hard. So how do you handle that?
I think it's a combination of approaches, and I should begin with a caveat that my approach, and all the things that, even in discussions with AP regarding craft, these are my solutions. They're not the only solutions, and they're, authors will all have different approaches, and all, in terms of what they're able to pull off, equally valid. And so I think the process for writing is going to be different with everyone. And I have talked occasionally with other writers. Most writers are pretty cagey on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But those I can get talking about it. It's very clear that each approach is quite unique, and quite often we can barely find common ground in terms of what we're what we're up to.
Sure.
So that, you know, that's the first thing I need to state, that these are my solutions, but they're only my solutions. And so, you know, take them for what they're worth. But I tend to actually, I discovered this early on when I was writing short stories in my writing program, that I start with theme. And then it becomes a case of making, if I were to sort of visualize it, it's, the theme is this big boulder in a field, and the story is built around that boulder. But in terms of the writing and in terms of what happens in the story, the rock is invisible, and all I'm doing is slapping clay on that invisible rock, and that's what gives it its shape. So in a sense, I try to pluck out anything that's explicit in terms of commentary on that particular theme. And then I just step around it and around it and around it, circle it from, you know, in a narrative sense and through characters and what they're doing, until I guess, you know, worn down all the paths all around it in that circle. And then you step back and yeah, that boulder's not there. It's invisible, but it's there at the same time. And so it's just, and that's, you know, that's as far as I'm able to go with it, simply by circling around it over and over again, you know, with different approaches. And it started because I understood very early on, because when I went into the writing program, I was in my early 20s, mid 20s. So, you know, I already had, I'd already been working as an archaeologist and had some, you know, degrees and all that kind of stuff. But I discovered that none of my themes survived the writing of the story. That was my early experience. And that was kind of startling and almost traumatic as an experience. But then I realized that that's actually a good thing, that the characters and the story and the narrative are challenging my assumptions. And I really started to enjoy that. And so for me, the writing process became one of, okay, I've got this, you know, the thematic idea, these notions, which are all founded upon, you know, worldviews, my belief systems. And it was a job of my characters to actually take me to task on those belief systems. And if I pushed hard enough and was relentless enough, then they would probably end up dismantling those belief systems. So with each story, I lost more certainty about the universe, about the world, and about my, where, you know, the belief system and the belief structure I had regarding that world. And that sort of became habitual, in a sense, that with fiction was all about basically attacking my belief systems. And that's how I you know, that's how the short stories sort of started taking shape. And so in that sense, if you think about it, the theme is the invisible thing, but the characters are all waging war against it in some fashion or another. So it's an unseen enemy for them.
That's wonderful. I mean, just to take your original analogy, then the theme is kind of like a very ancient barrow in the landscape that's been covered by years and years of dirt and grass and everything else, so that you might not even recognize that it's a barrow, I suppose. Oh, that's so wonderful. I love it. And the idea of you interacting with your characters to challenge those themes and all of that, that's really cool. Thank you for that. That's fantastic. AP, did you want to remark on anything there?
Well, it's interesting how you were referring to that there, because I mean, one of the techniques that I see in your books is where you have, say, a character undergo something happens to them, and then we will have another character who essentially faces a very similar experience or decision. So we're seeing exactly the same thing, but you alter the sort of the camera angle on it almost, so that as a reader you experience it one way, you're now experiencing it slightly different in a slightly different way, and then we see this repeated again. So each time we see these events, and it's not any specific single event, but we see them and we get them always from slightly different angles, perhaps slightly different outcomes, different emotions associated with them. And it's only when you take that step back that as a reader you can kind of reevaluate it and go, oh, that and that were all actually, when I think about it thematically, or when I think about it from this sort of more generalized perspective, they're all the same sort of thing, exploring this big idea. And each time it's allowing me better sight of that core idea in the middle. And, you know, I think one of the, like a very simple example of this is when we see, let's take the reaction to the cattle dog and the lapdog in Deadhouse Gates. And that's a little running gag and a running point of connection through the entirety of the chain of dogs. But each time, each of those little episodes shows different reactions to it. And it gives a three-dimensional construct of what those dogs actually mean to the chain of dogs. And then when we get to the end of the book, that scene with Mappo suddenly has a great deal more resonance, because you built up a 3D picture through these little scenes repeated throughout, points of connection throughout, that were never absolutely essential to the narrative, to the story being told. But that suddenly gives importance to that scene at the end. And it all ties back into, in that case, say, a theme of compassion, or a valuing things like that. And that's kind of what I meant by you see these things from different angles. We see it in Memories of Ice, both Silver Fox and Itkovian. Silver Fox, when she's challenged to release the Talana Mass, and she doesn't want to because they are going to be useful in the coming battle. Itkovian's response when faced with the Talana Mass is to, of course, go, of course I will take on all of your pain, and I will do this because that is the right thing to do. We see exactly the same sort of action. And whereas we look at Silver Fox and go, Silver Fox, that was very mean, but from a utilitarian perspective, yes, that makes perfect sense. Don't get rid of your best weapon. We see Itkovian and we go, well, we appreciate that it was the right thing to do, but could you not have waited a few days? And although both acts are so incredibly similar, it is surprising the number of people who don't see them in that way, that, you know, either they criticize both characters or they don't see that point of connection. But when we consider it, when we take that step back, we look at it in those sort of grander terms, that we've explored what it means to do the right thing at the right time, even if it's inconvenient.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. And I suppose then if you two are ready, we could start talking about the themes in each of the individual books a bit, and what maybe you feel some of the important themes are, or both of you, and I'll throw in my 2 cents as well, but beginning with Gardens of the Moon, and what sticks out to you there, because there are themes, of course, that are woven throughout the 10 books, obviously, and you have spoken many times, and many other people have also remarked on themes like compassion being woven through the entire series, or our realization, I guess compassion, this is included in compassion, isn't it? Our realization of our connection to other beings around us, other human beings and life all around us. That's, I feel like, a very important, anyway, for me, that really speaks to me in the books as well. And whether that be through the environmental aspects of the series and in many other ways, but that sense of connection, seeing yourself in the other, that sort of thing, that for me is a big theme that is just beautiful and woven through the series. But each of the books, what I've noticed on this reread is that each of the books also features a certain set of, it's as if these themes are threads that continue through the series, but they come to prominence a little bit more in certain books. So certain books seem to feature certain themes a little bit more, I think. So perhaps we could discuss each of the 5 books that AP and I have gotten through so far in that context. So either one of you, let's talk Gardens of the Moon. What are some of the important themes that come to the fore in your mind when you think of Gardens of the Moon?
This is so long ago.
Yeah, I know we're putting you on the spot there a little bit.
Well, why don't AP? Why don't you give that a shot, and then I can riff off of you.
Yeah, well, weirdly enough, out of all of the books, I think Gardens of the Moon is possibly the least thematic driven in terms of a lot of things that happen in the rest of the series.
Thanks for saying that. Thanks for saying that, because I'm thinking, wait a minute, themes. Yeah.
No, but what I will, what I think a lot of what Gardens of the Moon does is it acts as a key for a lot of the techniques and the approach that the series is going to take. So I suppose if you were going to call it a theme, you would perhaps call it subversion. And like, we bandy this word around so much, the subversion of tropes, the subversion of structure, and people we use it almost without thinking, as if it is a means to an end. And it isn't. It is just the thing. And how it's being used is actually what I think is more important. Because a trope or the subversion of a trope is irrelevant if it's not done well. But what we see in Gardens of the Moon, if we think of the structure itself, although there have been a lot of innovations in the genre since then, but the structure itself is a subversion of what we expect in a fantasy novel, because chapter 2, huge battle. And even the battle isn't told chronologically. There's the jumping around in time. We start with the aftermath, then we get before the battle, then we have a bit of the battle, then we go back to the aftermath. That it's not straightforward, but there's a massive conflagration and battle sequence right at the opening of the book. We have, because we've been with the perspective of the Malazans, we have an expectation that the Malazans are the good guys. And yet it is very clear in chapter 2, the Malazans are not the good guys, because they let their allies go in and slaughter, 10,000 people, men, women, and children, for having the audacity of beating them in trade disputes. And so we have this subversion of expectation about good and evil. We have, in the very beginning, we're introduced to the young Gano's Paran as a child. And then the next section is about him as a young officer being recruited essentially into the clandestine secret police to go on these missions. And you're going, yes, the young hero. And of course, that is again subverted. We see, the young girl being possessed by the patron of assassins. And we go, she's going to end up as some evil, villainous antagonist all the way through. That is subverted. Each of these things that we see is challenging the reader to go, this is not what you're expecting.
Right.
Characters are not just ciphers on a page that are there to serve the narrative function of propelling the overarching story. That this is a book, this is a series that is going to be playing with these notions. And I think that notion then of subversion, of structure, of character, of trope, the fact that it's unreliable narration, the close third-person focalization with a sort of semi-omniscient perspective, that is going to be the dominant style, which isn't third-person omniscient. It isn't third-person close focalization exactly. It has these movements which are in conversation with, but from a different perspective with what had been established in the genre. So that, I think, would be how I would categorize Gardens of the Moon. That the theme of Gardens of the Moon is that it is a key, it is a cipher for the techniques and what to expect that is going to happen in the rest of the series in entirely different ways in the rest of the series. Yeah. But this is laying it all out there.
It's very interesting, AP. You put it that way, and I love what you just said, because my wife is reading the series, and she just said to me a couple days ago, I feel like Gardens of the Moon is almost like a prologue to the entire series, that it sort of sets things up. So I guess that's kind of what you just very eloquently proved. So wonderful. Yeah.
Well, you say eloquently, and what you meant was long-windedly, because that was a far more eloquent way to put it.
So has AP given you enough to riff off of there?
Yeah, I think so. Gardens of the Moon. Okay, first of all, I've been reading fantasy since I was a kid, so I was very familiar with the genre. And then we did the gaming stuff, so I was familiar with that aspect and how that was feeding into and feeding off of the established subgenre of epic fantasy and some sword and sorcery, obviously. But I was in a writing program that was redirecting me to what they would call literary short fiction, literary fiction, contemporary fiction, whatever you wanted to call it, the serious stuff. And so in that sense, you know, you're not talking about the climax of a short story, you're talking about the epiphany. You know, it's completely toned down, if you will. And then then because it's toned down, plot-wise, there's a lot more emphasis on very subtle techniques that you use in terms of characterization, in terms of pacing, sentence structure. It's like the focus goes elsewhere. And so I was very much sort of, I guess, being guided to explore that side of things. So the contemporary fiction approach. And all my reading assignments and everything else were all pushing me in that direction. And of course, one of the things that was very important that was taught just as a matter of course, I think, to all students, at least in this program, was the necessity for the writer to step into the shoes of their character, to live as that character for a while before you start writing. And so a natural offshoot of that is that you have to ultimately become compassionate regarding that character. It's going to happen unless you sort of impose a kind of a narrative ego that's judgmental. But if you're actually living in the shoes and in the skin of that character, then you see the things from that character's point of view. How can you not be compassionate?
Yeah.
So that was sort of what I was learning in writing short stories. And so then it came to the point of, okay, I'm going to do a novel based on gaming and the screenplay and all the rest. But all my background is with respect to literary contemporary fiction.
Right.
So do I toss all that away and default to the genre conventions that were all around me in the fiction I was reading, or do I take what I know and try to sort of hammer it into shape within a fantasy context? And that was the decision I basically made. I don't think I could have done the other way, but I probably had that option. But then again, both Cam and I were railing against the tropes of the conventions of epic fantasy anyways. So, and whether that was triggered by, what I was learning in classes and reading, so-called serious literature, it remains an open question. But so that was the approach. So in that sense, when AP is saying subversion is one of the thematic driving forces of that novel, I guess yes, absolutely. And it was a novel basically written to, written to
One time.
take what I knew and what I'd learned writing, literary short stories, and just smash it into, the epic fantasy genre.
Yeah.
And I knew from the beginning this was going to be messy, So I thought, well, I might as well just have fun with it. And my memory of writing Gardens of the Moon is that I just had a blast. I had an absolute blast writing it. So
it's interesting when you were talking about learning your craft, and a big part of that being the ability to create empathy for the character and experience empathy for the character, probably as you're writing as well. You made me think of Adjunct Lorne. That's the character that it really happened for me, especially in Gardens of the Moon. So yeah, I certainly experienced that when I was reading. I definitely on the reread. I can't recall the first time around. It's too long ago, but it's a vivid feeling that is still with me. The idea that I was rooting for her to make the right decision, the moral decision, and and when it didn't, I felt it as almost a personal tragedy. And I felt for that character. I really felt for that character. So mission accomplished there.
Well, it's when you're, because I was doing this very specific type third person point of view, one, it limits, what I can put on the page, because what they experience and what they see is all I've got. But also when you're living in that, you as a writer, you're rooting for them, regardless of whatever their role is in the story. You have to almost sort of play act, and these are my motivations as this character, and they may be heinous, they may be horrible, but for that character, they're all rational, they all make sense, they all have purpose. And so in a sense, I think this, all the talk, and even I've used, the notions of compassion as a central theme, but that's almost an organic fallout of the writing method, and the structural approach I took on characters. It was inevitable in a sense that was going to happen, now that I think about it.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. AP, anything, or should we move on to Deadhouse Gates?
Well, like very, very quickly, just on because you raised about Lorne. I mean, if you look at the character of Lorne and her arc within Gardens of the Moon, and then you look at Gano's Parent and you look at his arc within Gardens of the Moon, and then you look at Sorry and look at her arc within Gardens of the Moon, and Crocus and look at his arc in Gardens of the Moon, and you can do a compare and contrast about are they being interfered with by a god? Do they have a magical object? Do they get what they are looking for, or are they defeated? You can actually go through a compare and contrast of all of the different narrative events that happen to them, all their different characteristics. Are their parents still alive? Are they, do all of those things. And when you look at those four characters are all exploring very similar things, but in very different ways. And because we get carried along by the narrative, because we get carried along by the story, sometimes we don't see those points of connection. You go, how can Crocus be like Lorne? But when you take a step back and start doing that analysis of the characters, you'll see that Crocus and Lorne actually share a lot in common. And Crocus and Sorry share a lot in common. And Perrin and Sorry share a lot in common. That it's almost like that story of Gardens of the Moon, and there's a great plot and everything that we follow about the Malazans and the Daru and Darujistan. All of this big story about Raist, about Anamander Rake, all of those elements, all really interesting, powerful story, narrative elements. But when you come down to it, it's actually about these characters. And they're the psychic connection, or the emotional connection between the reader and the story and the story world. They're how we are entering this world. It's how we are experiencing it. And because, weirdly enough, they have all of these different elements. It's almost like they are fragments of the same person, and we're experiencing the world from these different perspectives that are all actually part of the same experience.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, in that one of the techniques is that Erikson uses is obviously using similarities, but changing them just enough each time that it feels like a unique experience and gives you a different insight. So I think that's because people do say, oh, it's the Malazan is all about world building, or it's all about the grand themes, or all about the. It's all character driven. Everything is actually experienced through character, and it's not character driven in the sense that I think a lot of people mean, which is there's one character point of view, or there's 4 character point of views, and I'm going to spend 20 chapters with this one character and their perception of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But, and people think that that is a character novel. This is a different way of doing a character novel, that each time it's about these characters interacting with the world. And then once you're done, and this is, the analyst in me, taking a step back and thinking about who each of these characters are, what are the different elements that make them up, because that is actually revealing of the different experiences that we've just had.
Yeah, I would add one more thing regarding Gardens of the Moon, is that it was a signpost, and it was intended as one anyways, especially with the opening structural shenanigans that are going on that change the timeline and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it, again, I think even that was kind of organic fallout to the literary approach, because once I sort of became fascinated with character, and being in their skin and wearing their shoes, whatever, it suddenly, it would have probably have occurred to me that it's not the event, it's not the action, it's not the battle sequences, it's not those things they're there, but they are like forces of the natural world that happen to every one of us in some fashion or another. We interact with this world, and things happen, and some things are tragic and some things aren't. But what interests me, and this is probably the literary side of things, is what do you do with it? What is the aftermath? Where do you go once you've experienced these things? And that's what, in many respects, that's why you see Tattersail after the battle first. Mm-hmm. And then that provides a kind of a emotional end point for that whole opening chapter. And then I show the reader how she got there. And I guess in a sense that's sort of waving a flag regarding structure, that yes, there's going to be a lot of action in this stuff. There's going to be a lot of, crazy scenes. And the whole rooftop stuff is just pure action. Crocus at the end of the novel, where he's throwing bricks, at gods. This is just me having a blast, and it there's nothing else to that, in a sense. This is what happens in that world, and it's what happens in our world, in some respect. So it's what characters do, and how they act and how they think in response to things that happen to them. And I guess that's where the compassion comes in. So just naturally.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I think that also is probably a good segue for Deadhouse Gates, because there's plenty of that going on as well in Deadhouse Gates, where we move to a new continent and we meet some new characters, quite a few new characters, although there are some carryover characters as well, some of the ones we were just talking about. But so AP and or Steve, AP, you want to get us started on what are the prominent themes to you for Deadhouse Gates?
Hang on a sec, Philip. Yeah. I went first last time. It's your turn to go first. So let's hear your thoughts on it.
Okay, so Deadhouse Gates. I'm being a polite host, don't you know? So So
You're avoiding doing your own homework. That's what you're doing.
You know me too well. So first of all, yeah, I mean, there is the idea of obviously compassion in there, and it's from beginning to end. There's the Fellowson thread in there, which to me is an invitation to the reader in many respects to empathize with the characters on her journey, not just Fellowson, but also there's Heboric and Bowden, and the dynamic between the three of them is something that feels so real to me, because these are people who are going through some just awful things, terrible things. And it's not obviously going to bring the best out in you when you're going through some really horrible stuff. And I think all of us have been at points in our lives where we know we're not putting our best foot forward because things around us just seem like they're not going well. And that's an understatement in this case. So we have these characters who are constantly biting at each other and tearing at each other. And there's a point in there where Fellowson even realizes, I'm doing this because I'm lashing out at myself in some respects. So that all changes, that shifts. I mean, there are definitely points along the journey. It's not like there's just one magical moment where suddenly they're nice to each other. There's a whole journey that happens here, and there are moments along the journey where they connect, where they acknowledge each other, that they acknowledge each other's suffering, which it's ironic because they're suffering together, and yet they don't always see that. There's a barrier to their ability to connect with one another because of the suffering. So there's an irony there. But one of the most beautiful moments, and I know AP, this is a moment that you've talked about as being incredibly touching to you as well, is and this is a spoiler if you haven't read Deadhouse Gates, but it's the moment when Fellowson is cradling Bowden after they've met the divers, that is a bunch of rats whose name escapes me at the moment.
Krillin.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so that is a very powerful thing, especially when you realize how much they've missed these opportunities again and again. And then at this particular moment, and I feel like Heboric and Fellowson have some of that as well toward the end, where she comes upon the book and has to make this very important decision about what her next role is going to be. So that to me is a great. And then there's obviously the whole chain of dogs, and I'm not going to say a lot on that because I said a lot about the Fellowson arc. So I'll let AP perhaps talk about the chain of dogs, and there are various themes that are linked into the chain of dogs, including, of course, the empathy. And you have the very end of the whole thing, where this catastrophic scene occurs. And AP, you've talked again about how a lot of the pathos of that scene comes from the witnesses, the fellow who has to shoot Squint at the end. He's the one that makes you break down at that moment and in shuddering and trying to suppress the sobs. It's an interesting thing how that happens. Yes, Coltane is the one who's doing the suffering, but it's also we're feeling everything through and witnessing is another, by the way, of course, we haven't mentioned it yet, but witnessing is a huge theme throughout this series, and we certainly see it at play there. So I'll shut up now and AP, your take.
Well, oddly enough, I mean, if I was going to be picking a theme for Deadhouse Gates, I think the effect that the theme that I'm going to talk about is the idea of empathy, the idea of compassion. But I think one of the themes of Deadhouse Gates is actually the concept of the journey, the concept. So we could look at it as the subversion of the quest trope, because we've seen that so often in genre fantasy of, here's your quest, you're destined to go and do this thing. Collect plot coupon A, B, C, defeat bad guy. Congratulations, you've leveled up, on to the next quest. What we encounter in Deadhouse Gates is very much a whole series of quest novels. It's a whole series of journeys. It's a whole series of exploring this idea of the physical travel of a quest, but also the emotional journey, the spiritual journey. Think of Hiboric and the journey that he goes on. Now, is it complete by the end of Deadhouse Gates? No. But a lot of what Hiboric's character arc in that is actually a spiritual journey of his relationship to his God, his relationship to the idea of divinity, and his relationship even as a priest. We see Felicent's journey, being sold, removed from her family, put into slavery, the story of abuse, of being an abuse victim, of being a drug addict, and the whole emotional as well as physical journey that she experiences. We see Kalam heading on the heroic hero going on his quest to enact vengeance. We have Duiker's journey, starting as the cynic, being attached to this chain of dogs, and by the end of it, being a fervent believer, being converted along the way. And obviously, as a reader viewpoint, this is how one of the ways that we get converted to being a believer in Coltane. We have the whole journey of the whole of the chain of dogs. We see the nobles and the journey that they go on, where they are blind, absolutely blind to everyone around them. They can only see their own needs. We see the suffering of their servants, the soldiers dying to protect them. All of these different journeys in this particular novel. And I think it is a novel all about the idea of the journey. And from it, we start to understand that it is not necessarily the end point, the conclusion, the goal. That is not necessarily the most important thing. Like, it sounds like a cliche, but the journey itself sometimes is the thing. And instead of these arcs where, yes, this is what we're setting out to do, and here are the troubles that we had along the way, and lo and behold, we overcame them and achieved our goal. That's not how life works. That's not always the best way to learn, that there are failures, that there are problems. And I think that's a big theme in Deadhouse Gates.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, we have an exploration of empathy, an exploration of compassion, an exploration of what it means to be a victim, what it means to be perceived as a victim. You know, and I think a lot of that is what I see in Deadhouse Gates, and it's one of the reasons why I find it such an emotionally powerful novel.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm not going to counter any of those observations, I think, but I think I'm kind of in the process of building almost a different interpretation of the entire series as we're going here.
Cool.
And it relates back to all, my learning curve at the University of Victoria was ridiculously steep, with respect to writing fiction and writing short fiction. One of the things about your classic contemporary short story is that it is a local, focalized microcosm of the human condition. That is the whole purpose. You pick any one of those stories, and it reflects in some fashion something far more vast than just that particular sequence of events or those characters. And that's sort of what drives the literary author. It's that they're basically, taking a magnifying glass to a handful of scenes, and in conveying those scenes in a particular way, they are creating a resonance that relates to that of the universe of the reader. And so it's universal human conditions. So if you look at Deadhouse Gates, you're seeing both the micro and the macro, and that's what the novel is about. So the smallest gestures and then the fractal sort of representation on the grandest scale possible, which is why when you see Coltane at the end of that book and that whole thing, that is witnessed from the top of the wall from a distance. So it's masses of people. It's just this sort of grand movement of forces and armies and all the rest. But you've had a parallel that's been running through all of this. And the parallel is Felicin, Bodin, and Hiborg. Okay, noble, protector, and historian. So that is the nobles, Coltane, and Duiker. It's just the two different scales are just stretched out as far as I could possibly go on them. And the dogs are the representation of that as well, because you've got this tiny lap dog and this big bruising cattle dog. You know, it's each time I'm sort of pulling it in that way. You've got Icarium and Mappo, and Icarium is chaos constrained, and Mappo is clearly very physically powerful, but also the softest soul in the entire series, you know. And so in each case, there's sort of this thing going on, and I'm thinking on it now that is very much a short story approach. That is very much taking those very small moments and those small scenes. But in a short story, you leave the big scenes, the big human condition elements. They're not on the page. They resonate and echo off the page into the reader. But in Deadhouse Gates, they're on the page. So they're both there. So it's like a relationship between short stories and novel is at work in the second book, I think. Thoughts? I mean, I'm building the thesis as I go, so you know, I could be full of shit, but I'm looking on it now, and you know, Deadhouse Gates was the beginning of writing it was on this sense of elation that I'd already just signed for Gardens of the Moon. The book had come out. It was like this is the first time I had sort of external validation that you know the book was worthwhile and a publisher had picked it up, and I was flying high in terms of writing Deadhouse Gates, because now I really felt like, okay, I could roll up my sleeves and just go for it.
Nice. So Memories of Ice, shall we move on? For me, should I well, I'll just throw out a quick thing and then I'll let you go first, AP, and then we'll let Steve riff off of that. But for me, Memories of Ice, obviously all this stuff we've been talking about, the compassion and so forth, but the influence of the past, the connection of the past to the events of the present, I think is something that is really very important to Memories of Ice. And this is the one that begins with a prologue that's 300,000 years or so. I forget the exact date, but in the past. And then another prologue that's 100,000 years or so in the past. And so the connection of past events, whenever they happened, to the present, the layers of culture and civilization and how they are part of what we are now, as if you can hear the echoes. And for me, this is a big thing throughout the series, the idea that suffering and trauma are things that we see in patterns, that they could be familial patterns, they could be personal patterns, they could be cultural patterns, suffering and trauma induced by patriarchy, for example. I mean, there's just, so this is a book that for me really brings home, and in several ways, not just with those prologues, but it's the weight of the past and the patterns that the past has established as informing and in some ways even dictating the events of the present. And it's a tough thing to overcome those patterns. And we see a moment of extreme compassion in here with Itkovian, and the talk about the weight of the past when you talk about the Talana Mas. Wow. And that particular scene where he extends his mercy, is that what it is? I mean, where he takes their suffering and their pain, and it frees them, essentially, frees them from that weight of the past that has been so oppressive for so long. So that's a big theme for me in here, is this sense of connection between the past and the present. So AP, what are you thinking about in terms of Memories of Ice?
Well, like I agree with you on this, and this is something obviously we saw in Gardens of the Moon, we saw in Deadhouse Gates. The past never disappears. The past is always with us, and I think you're right that in Memories of Ice, it is now become more apparent because it is there in Deadhouse Gates. It is there in Gardens of the Moon. Yeah. This idea that we are shaped by the past. As much as we like to think of ourselves as, oh, I'm a self-made man, or I'm my own person. It's like, well, yeah, but you're a person of circumstance. And in those circumstances, you have genetic material from your parents and how you were raised and the socioeconomic background you were from and the educational opportunities that you had. And how you were raised, let's say your parents, and you go, well, yeah, but they're influenced by the same things as well. So there's their genetic makeup from their parents and how they were raised, and how were they raised? Well, that's actually going to go back to their to your grandparents, and so on. There is a continuity of our behavior, which is as a direct consequence of everything that has happened before, going all the way back in time. And the past is not something that's done and gone. It is always part of our present. And like we see in Deadhouse Gates, the treatment of the Wiccans. Yeah. And there's a whole back history to that whole Malazan occupation. But we're talking about Memories of Ice. And I think it comes to the fore here because, again, not only are we returning to a previous book, like we're returning to a lot of the stuff from Gardens of the Moon. So there's a direct structural point of connection to this exploration. But we also see that this is not just about the Empire. The Empire is the latest incarnation of something, that the world itself is shaped by all of these things from the past. So it broadens the scope of the story out by including the Tilana Mass, by including the Jagat, by including this idea of glacial systems, slow change to the world, that everything might seem devastating at the time, or might seem that it's going to last forever, but slow change always comes about, but it is always dependent on the thing that came before. And with the Malazans treaty, the truce or alliance with the Tistandi and Kaladin Brood's army, we see the transitory nature of political alliances, that the past is seemingly forgotten until, well, actually, no, it's not forgotten, and it all goes to hell. Yeah. We see that even great military commanders can make mistakes. That we see even Anomander, and we have all of these ideas about who Anomander Rake is. He's this very distant figure. And then we meet Envy. And when she's traveling with that group, and we realize, no, Anomander has a past, and that past is very human in the way that we understand it. Yeah. And again, different perspectives, but what is Envy doing? Why is she going there? All of these different things. And again, all of that is based on the history of what has happened before, affecting what is about to happen. So I think you're absolutely right that in this book, a lot of the past coming to fruition in the present, or influencing the present, is a big theme of this. But again, because, as Steve outlined, we're approaching it from all these different angles, and we see these tight character perspectives. The empathy and compassion of what is going on still comes through, and we see these events. Whiskey Jack killing the Tenaskari commanders, and where Rake had stepped forward, and Whiskey Jack thought that he was doing the right thing by preventing them being killed by Dregnapur. Yeah. And in some respects, he is absolutely right, because that would have consigned them to that sword. But it's only later he realizes, when he sees the reaction of his troops, that Rake wasn't bloodthirsty and wanting to feed his sword in that moment. He was trying to spare Whiskey Jack pain. The idea of perspective, the idea of seeing things from someone else's point of view, walking in their shoes. This is something that's very difficult in today's society when we are so heavily polarized, when we're so heavily tribalized,
Yes.
that the idea of seeing any merit to someone else's perspective other than your own goes deeply against what is now being ingrained into us on a daily basis. Yeah. But I think that's a big aspect of what happens in this story. We still see fans argue about what Tok does, even though he's influenced by a god. He's a trained assassin, spy, thief who can blend in. He's going to get himself killed if he stays with that group. And you go, well, yeah, those are all reasons, you know, and he's influenced by a god, but I still don't buy it. I still think, you know, he made a mistake. You go, well, he might have made a mistake, but he was influenced by a god. He had things going for him. There are reasons for it. Yeah, but I don't think he should have done it. You know, look at it from his perspective, not your perspective, knowing what is going to happen to him. Oh yeah, but it was obvious that was going to happen. No, it bloody wasn't. No one could have foreseen at that moment in time that he was going to get captured and given to a Kachin Chamal matron to be hugged repeatedly to death. That was not obvious at any point in his journey.
He didn't have a lot of great options there, to be frank. So poor fellow. Steve, your thoughts on, I have one other theme I want to talk about for sure in Memories of Ice, but I want to get your thoughts so far.
Not much to add. I mean, it's also to some extent about origin stories, origin mythology.
Yeah.
And how those, well, they get frozen in ice, and then, you know, it has to be thawed in some fashion. But, you know, with respect to Itkovian, the reason why it had to be Itkovian and not Silver Fox to free the Talana Mass points directly to Itkovian's notions of compassion, because Itkovian had no bone in that fight, whereas Silver Fox did.
Yeah.
And so if it had been a Talana Mass freeing the Talana Mass, there's no impact on that, and thematically that is. Yeah. But having Itkovian just show up out of the blue, and I you know, the writing of him, I kept him quite restrained, but so that we saw a lot of how people reacted to him, and quite often he was baffled at how they reacted to him. I mean, there's a whole scene where he comes into the confab with Brood and company on the hill, I think, and a soldier gives him, or he exchanges helmets, I think, with the soldier.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So he has no idea that, you know, how he's being viewed by others, which is sort of raising the flag that this is the character that whose actions will have, you know, profound consequences. And so that's why, in a sense, it has to be not someone of the tribe to free the tribe, but someone completely outside that, and not connected to it.
Yeah.
But anyways, go on with what you're going to say.
Well, on that point, see, and this would be the difference between what you intended someone to get and what I got from it, because I looked at it in terms of Silver Fox was destined to do this. This is why she was created. And if she had done it, then that's just the whole predestination. This was always going to happen. And it would have felt trite and unearned. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I liked Itkovian doing it is he's actually separated from his God. He has no destiny. He has no spiritual or divine backup. He is simply a mortal, simply a man trying to do the right thing. He doesn't have the divine backup of Fenner anymore. He goes into it and he knows that this is going to cost him. And this is where I know people like to make that sort of Christ-like comparison to Itkovian, but this is something I think that is actually important about him as a character. This is entirely human. Mm-hmm. This is a human character with no divine power, with no divine connection, that is going to do this knowing it is likely to destroy him. Yeah. And he still does it. And that, for me, is why Itkovian is so much more powerful That scene with the Covian and the message of that is so much more powerful than if it had been Silver Fox, a magically created, magically powerful, connected to all of these things, destined to free the Talana Mass, and was created solely for that reason, that she was made a tool and denied her own agency to do this thing, that I think it is natural for her not to do it. Because no, she is asserting her own right to self-determination. And I think that was an important point about Silver Fox. But for Itkovian, it was that aspect of, no, this is the ultimate human act. This has nothing to do with gods. This has nothing to do with any of that aspect. It is what humans should be doing. So, I mean, I can see your point, but that was the way that I interpreted it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an issue with that interpretation, but it always amuses, when I hear on the side of you're acting as if I simply recorded what Silver Fox did, right? I mean, the entire circumstances surrounding her and the destiny that awaited her and all the rest, right? I mean, yeah, but I built that up in order to create the contrast with Itkovian.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. You built all of these things up, so that's why I think her having that moment of self-determination is actually, that's quite powerful. And if you had just gone, yeah, and she's just going to do it anyway, I would have felt let down. It wouldn't have been a powerful moment. And so that's why I like how you crafted it. That's why I like the comparison and contrast of Itkovian and Silver Fox. And it's one of the reasons why I think what you did with Itkovian's actions works so powerfully.
Well, speaking of Silver Fox and the other theme that I wanted to bring in here in terms of Memories of Ice, Steve, you wrote a very powerful essay that you posted on Facebook once, and it was mostly about your mother. And I found it very beautiful. And this is, of course, one of the most prominent themes. We talked about familial relationships and we talked about compassion. Our most primal, our first relationship for most of us is with our mothers. And you begin this book with a prologue that has a mother featured in it, and a woman who had just had a child. So there are two mothers really in that prologue. There's the Jagat mother, and there's Kalava. And so you're hinting early on that motherhood is going to be a big part of this. And of course, there's the matron later on. And I think most importantly and most obviously, the Maib that's that thread having to do with motherhood and the sacrifices that mothers make and what they pass on to us. And that can be sometimes a very fraught thing in some ways. So the relationship between the Maib and Silver Fox is a very compelling part of Memories of Ice for me as well. And I think we all have that. We all have that very, very primal, important relationship with our mothers. So for me, this was, I don't know if you had thoughts on it, AP or Steve or either one of you, but I just feel like that's a really great theme in there.
I mean, postpartum depression it's a curious thing, right? It's a recognized condition, psychological condition. But it has a cultural element, or maybe not. Maybe it may not be cultural at all now that I think about it. It has an element that cuts past the clinical and goes straight to the heart of things. Because the notion of a mother betraying their child or even taking the life of their child hits people on a level that basically nothing else can. And so I found it interesting, but not surprising, the extent of the harsh judgment of readers regarding that storyline.
Yeah.
The rejection of it, if you will, because it's sort of enunciating the dark underside of the relationship between a mother and a child. And that's something that nobody really wants to approach and really have to deal with. But it's, I don't know, it's just one that fantasy as a genre made it possible to actually explore that. in a way that provided a little bit of distance for the reader, but yeah.
Yeah, and certainly reading it this time, being I'll have to be honest about this, a little bit older than the first time I read it. The storyline with the Maib and the storyline with the matron, seeing the matron as the smothering monstrous mother, and literalizing that metaphor, but seeing the Maib then of the cost of what raising us is to a mother, that we are life-sucking parasites. Some of us longer than others. I tried to extend my adolescence well past my 30s. But seeing that explored, and in something that is billed as an epic fantasy, is billed as a military fantasy that has all of these things, seeing something as important as aspects of motherhood being explored in that, I thought was, again, a subversion of reader expectation. But why aren't these things part of novels? And it's interesting that I've been having a discussion about representation of women and motherhood in fantasy with my wife, part of her research, and she objects to the use of women or female characters always being reduced to their womb, their biological function, this aspect of motherhood. And taking her points and looking at this, what is nice is the balancing of both those storylines about motherhood. Silver Fox's storyline about the daughter. We also have Corlat's storyline of almost like the young maiden. We have Crone's storyline, that we have a lot of female figures that are being used archetypally to present these sort of symbolic aspects. And it's not reducing each or any of the characters down to a biological function. It's more exploring, at least to me, it is exploring the various aspects of symbolism, literalizing metaphors, and exploring emotional resonance, because even in epic fantasy, this is an important psychological thing to be considered, and it ties into how all of us were created.
Right. It's all laid out in the prologue.
Yeah.
Of Memories of Ice, and if you think of it following Deadhouse Gates, where the last, the most, I guess, impactful scene is that big macro, the fall outside Erin, and so we're thinking in terms of huge war, continent spanning war. So the kind of follow-on echo to that is the opening of Memories of Ice, because here is your continent spanning war, but it's involving all of 12 people. So again, I just scale everything back down, but of course everything is triggered, and yes, it's Jagut and Jagut mother with her 2 children, and so the deal she makes is basically to give up her children in the hopes that they will survive. Not too different from Tavor giving up Phyllis in the hopes that she will survive. But the deal is made with Calava, is it not? And is not Calava someone who has either lost or given up her child? Right. So, everyone just sort of kicks on, and there's a domino effect that's set up at that early stage. But yeah, the prologue basically lays out those thematic elements, those elements of motherhood, and all the various facets of that relationship are all there.
Yeah, it's all there.
Yeah.
Beautifully done. Yeah. All right. So how about House of Chains? This is the 4th book, and I think that a lot of what we said will most certainly apply. it's interesting for me. There's a slight variation on that weight of the past theme. In House of Chains, you have the it's as if the narratives that we tell ourselves of the past, the revealing of those narratives as being perhaps not as accurate as we might think. So that for me is an important theme throughout the series, because I love what you do a lot of the times with historians, Steve, where you have historians who are very aware of the limitations of their profession, and how that is true, I think, of the best historians around today as well. They understand that these are narratives that we tell to make sense of things, to put things in a certain place, in a certain order. And in the process of doing that, we erase certain other things. And so it's not the truth. History is not the truth, as perhaps some people think of it. It's one of those fields where I suspect the more you know, the more you know you don't know. So I love what you do with that. But in Karsa, we have a character who is carrying around a narrative with him, and that narrative gets challenged in some very serious ways. And as a result, that is a big impetus behind this character's journey. And a lot of what he learns through his interactions with other characters, such as Torvald Nam, for example. And he learns a little bit about empathy and compassion, doesn't he, in the process? And it's interesting, very interesting. I think one of the most talked about character arcs in the entire series actually is probably Karsa's. So that's certainly a big part of House of Chains.
Well, there's a thematic point that I want to talk about, as well as a structural point, because again, I think one of the things explored in the series, although not technically theme, is playing around with structure. So the first book, with quite a long section of action sequences that it was very cinematic. Yep. The second book, I think about a lot of the quest stuff. The third book, I think, is probably what we think of as the most traditional structure in epic fantasy, of the two sides, of the building up of these big battles and wars. But what we have with House of Chains is then a subversion of that. Again, going down to a very personal, character-driven, character-focused initial narrative. And then after following that, establishing who Karsa is and what's going on, connecting that back to the broader world that is being explored, a very personal journey, and then that is being brought back into the main sort of narrative landscape that has been created. Right. So this obviously is a subversion of what the reader expectation is of a Malazan novel, because we've had 3 where something like this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's going back to that idea of subversion, which I think is a recurring theme, something that is used again and again. Yeah. But in terms of the thematic stuff, particularly with Karsa, the idea in Memories of Ice of the past having repercussions for the future, we now see a very personal impact of that, but on a tribal scale, on a community scale. Whereas in Memories of Ice, we saw how something that happened in the past had these massive ramifications on almost a global stage, right, about this conflict, this war between the Malazans and the Pani and Domin. In House of Chains, we see how the past, the lies of the past, the myths that have built up, the structures of society are the things that dominate Karsa's worldview, because it's incredibly insular. And it's only through Karsa's experience with people other than his tribe, people outside his tribe, that he starts to be able to reevaluate his position, his tribe, his ideologies, his bias. And this, again, ties into this idea of compassion, this idea of empathy. It is through experience of other people's perspectives, other cultures, other religions, other ways of looking at the world, other people's life experiences, that allow us to take a step back from who we are and our view of what the world is, of what reality is, to see it from a different angle. And we see this literalized in this book. It's not just about telling people, oh, you know, you need to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. It's, no, here's a character. We're going to follow this character, and he's absolutely terrible, and he does these terrible things. Yeah. Now, look what happens when he encounters a world that is different to his expectations. Look at how he is shaped and changed, how aspects of his life are absolutely destroyed, and he is shown the lies. But instead of doubling down and going, no, I'm going to believe it anyway, he takes it as an opportunity to learn. And that, I think, is incredibly powerful in this narrative. And it's something that we sometimes overlook because we want to judge Karsa for the terrible things that he does in the book.
Right.
You know, this character does these horrible things. He's a bad character. I can't like him. He's incredibly well realized. But what does he do when he encounters the rest of the world? He learns from it.
Yeah.
He starts to grow and change. Is it always for the better? No, he's still shaped by his past. He's still shaped by his culture, but he tries to incorporate aspects of the world into himself. Yeah. It is a work in progress. Like our lives are always a work in progress. It was a fridge magnet, I think, a friend of mine had, which was, teenagers, leave the house now while you still know everything. I think we all went through this stage where we were absolutely convinced this is exactly how the world should be and this is how everyone should do things. And the older I have gotten, the more I have come to appreciate being flexible and going, you know what, I need to wind my neck in, take a step back from what I think is right and listen to it from another side. Yeah. That every situation, as simple and as straightforward as I think it is, there's usually at least a million other ways of looking at that situation. And I need to start incorporating that into my life. So that was a big aspect of the theme in House of Chains for me, because when we see it applied to Tavor, we get this external view of Tavor. We know Tavor as Ganos' sister, who we didn't meet in Gardens of the Moon. And then we had that little tiny shot of her in Deadhouse Gates. And now in House of Chains, we have all of those presumptions, all of those preconceived notions. We have judged her. We have been judge, jury, and executioner for this character of how dare she do that to Felicen, because we haven't challenged our assumptions and looked at it from her point of view. And now in this book, we see her soldiers doing the same thing. We see everyone questioning what she is doing. And it's only when we try, and Steve doesn't give us this opportunity to experience it from her POV. He limits us to this external view. Right. And it makes it incredibly challenging then to think about it from her perspective.
Yeah.
And this is, you know, one of those big lessons. It's very easy when you're sitting down in dialogue with someone and they can explain their point of view and you can talk it all out and you can spend hours discussing it and maybe come to an understanding. But we don't always get that opportunity. Sometimes we have to look at a situation, we can make our judgments, and we forget that we still need to extend that same ability, try and think about it from their side.
Right.
That is a core aspect of empathy. It is a core aspect of compassion. It is a core aspect of remaining sane in the world.
Yeah. Boy, Karsa could have saved himself a lot of trouble by just joining the Peace Corps.
Well, yeah. This is a novel where the title contains all of the theme. So, you know, in many respects, a lot of the previous storylines have related to family in some fashion or another. But then the family can extend, metaphorically, become your tribe, whatever that tribe happens to be. And you dwell in that house. And then, you know, the whole opening of the novel is Karsa leaving the house. And on the other side, you've got Tavor and Felicin, who have both, in a sense, left the house and are at the same time, through circumstances just like Karsa, they're bound by the chains that were laid on each individual within that house, whatever that house may be. So this is the one instance where I was pretty explicit in the theme by virtue of the title.
Yeah, and speaking of Felicin and Tavor, in sort of a similar way to how mothers were prominent in the previous book, sisters are a big feature of House of Chains, and central to this whole story is the relationship between Felicin and Tavor and the misunderstandings, because of course Felicin is going through believing that Tavor essentially betrayed her, and betrayal also being a pretty important theme in here, as it is in the next book as well. But Tavor acting in tragic ignorance of what's going on with her sister, and it's not as if anyone here is to blame. Neither sister is. This is in no way condemning either one of them for where they end up. It's just this sort of this tragic meeting between the two that is the climax of this. And I love, by the way, how you set that up, and how maybe this is what AP is talking about again with the upsetting of tropes, and we're expecting a big battle scene to be the climax of this book, and instead it is we've basically got a magnifying glass, and we're homing in on these two sisters, and rather than there is a kind of battle that takes place before that, but not the one we expected exactly. But what we get are these two sisters and this one single, very quick act of violence that ends it tragically. But the relationship between these sisters, even though they don't speak to each other through the whole book, it's amazing. But it's there the whole time. You know, they are speaking to each other in their minds, at least. So just so powerful. And, again, as you said, the familial relationships are very central to the entire series. And here we see sisters being brought to the fore.
About that sequence at the end, obviously, like Steve and I did a video where we went through that chapter to sort of break it down. But one of the points of comparison that always occurs to me when I read that sequence is, I don't know if you recall the film Troy.
Oh yeah.
For better or for worse, this is not about the whole film, but the sequence where Achilles is summoned because the two sides are faced off, and they're going to be decided by the two champions.
Yeah.
And, Achilles is still lying in bed. But he comes up, and because of audience expectation, all of the sides are lined up, and they're expecting this big titanic battle where they're going to fight from morning till night. These things that have been sold to us in myths and in legends and in these stories. And of course, Achilles rocks up to the battlefield hungover, and he's right. And he just starts running down, and the guy throws it, and he goes past one hit, done, and then walks back, and the guy tumbles down and dies.
Right.
And in some respects, you look at that, and it is incredibly underwhelming. It subverted your expectations. You were expecting a big titanic clash. And then you have this appreciation of, oh, well, this is how good Achilles is. And there's a lot of confused and conflicted responses in you as you witness this. And I think we get that at the end of House of Chains as well, because ultimately, all wars, all battles come down to the personal. It's the people on the ground. It's individual lives that are being decided on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And here it is literalized, because it is these two women. And we have the ultimate tragedy, in the very Greek sense of tragedy, that has been a theme from the very beginning. These gods interfering in mortals' lives, playing out their games, playing out their contests, where the characters, the humans, the mortals, are their pawns. That these great powers are using the normal people to play things out. And so we have that moment where Felison is obviously, she's been possessed and the possession leaves. She is suddenly herself, but it is too late. Yeah. And it's enormously tragic. There's a huge amount of emotion attached to that. But when we take that step back from it, and we think in comparison to Karsa's story, don't think about it literally as the gods messing with humans. Think about it as the powerful manipulating the powerless, using them as pawns. We see that with the false gods of the Tiblor, right, influencing Karsa. We see this in that sort of thematic sense of the most powerful abusing their power at the cost of innocent lives. And then you can apply that in a more general sense to the modern day, to our world, thinking about power dynamics. Yeah. And what I like about fantasy, what I like about a lot of these books, is the literalization of these metaphors, of these symbols, to see them explored and to think about them in that thematic sense, that symbolic sense of taking that step back to think about not just the literal what happened on the page, but what this actually means in terms of power dynamics, in terms of cultural manipulation, in terms of doing things because this is the way that they have always been done. How traditions, yes, they may be traditions. Are they harmful? But we've always done them that way. But are they harmful? Stop using the fact that they have always existed, right, as an excuse for their perpetual imposition on society, their in perpetuity. That this is, I think, fascinating, that House of Chains, as Steve was saying, we build the chains ourselves. We build we surround ourselves with chains. We force ourselves into these things because of how we think, how society thinks we should think, that we don't question these things, that we find a tribe and we go, I adopt the tribe and I stop. I don't take account of, sometimes you have to challenge the tribe. That all of these things, and they are complex, nuanced questions. It's not that these books have the answer. These books are posing the question and showing different ways of approaching the question, of exploring answers, not trying to be didactic in any way and say, this is what you must do, but actually encouraging us to engage and explore these concepts. And yes, they are literal stories on the page, but there's a deeper thematic and symbolic aspect that's being explored. And, you know, that I think is a fascinating aspect, particularly of this book.
Yeah, the failure to question tradition reminds me of Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery. It's, of course, that's the theme there as well. And this is also a very important theme in the next book, Midnight Tides, the failure to question tradition. Serious consequences there. So do we want to move on to Midnight Tides, or anyone want to add anything to House of Chains then?
No, I just would mention that in the film Troy, that was the scene I loved the most.
Yeah.
It's like the opening scene of the film, isn't it? Or pretty close to it.
Close to it.
Fabulous. Yeah. That was, you know, that was the best way to convey the consummate killer. Yeah. And, you know, couldn't have done it better.
Yeah, and he was facing a much, much bigger, scarier guy, and he just jumped up and plunged his sword down. Yeah. Very effective scene.
Very effective, yeah.
So Midnight Tides, I mentioned that the failure to question tradition, something you set up really well, Steve, in the prologue. A couple themes that just leap to mind. One is betrayal, I mentioned earlier, as being an important theme in Midnight Tides. And also this time it's brothers who are prominent in terms of the familiar relationships. So you have different sets of brothers. You have in the beginning, Silkus Ruin in the prologue being talked of. He's not his literal brother, but he and Scavendari Bloodeye. Scavendari refers to him as a brother. And it refers to the competition between brothers. And this is foreshadowing the sets of brothers that we have. You have the Sengar brothers among the Taist Edur, and you have the Bedict brothers as well. So these are obviously, this is very deliberate. This is the barrow you put in the landscape, I guess, and we have some pretty wonderful narrative around it. I mean, this is AP has brought attention to the fact that each of these stories narratively happens differently. Midnight Tides is very distinctive, I think, in terms of its narrative structure, because, and AP, you and I talked about this when we discussed it. It has these halves almost. In the beginning, it feels like you have the more serious and weighty and tragic stuff going on with the Taist Edur. It's told primarily through the POV of Troll and Udanas, and that has, you know, that feels very serious and tragic. And then you have the comedic side of this, which is told through the characters in Leatheros, and those include, of course, Tehol Bedict, my favorite character from the entire series, and his relationship with Bug is just beautiful. But you also have Shirk and other characters. You have a lot of shenanigans going on there, but there is this gradual converging of these two, and tonally as well. We talked about this, how tonally the two things sort of merge, as well as the characters literally clash with one another. So all that is going on, and plenty more. So either one of you want to remark on Midnight Tides?
Well, the thing I wanted to mention regarding those two sides is that for the reader, the side of the Taist Edur is going to be the most alien. I mean, it's tribal. It's partially structured on West Coast sedentary tribes, and exactly where I live right now. Even though the impetus for the what if idea is referring to Lakota Sioux, they're not culturally anything like that. You know, people think in terms of the evolution of human culture as going from the hunter-gatherer to maybe nomadic pastoralism, or and then horticulture and then agriculture. But there is another path, and that is the path of coastal adaptation, which allows for sedentarianism without agriculture playing a role. And so the West Coast of North America is a prime example of that. Japanese culture would be another one. But curiously, those cultures will have very, very strict rules of behavior and interaction. Very, very strict. In a sense that for the average reader, that's going to feel very alien.
Right.
And so even though I've got Trell Sengar as a point of view for that stuff, he's questioning that structure all the time. And then as a counterpoint, I mean, the West Coast cultures here, native cultures, were slave keeping cultures. So I needed a slave in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And that probably dictated a lot of the tone, is that this was going to be alien. And so we're going to have to sort of be a little bit more rigid and rule bound in terms of their comportment, their behavior. But then you go to Leatheros, and suddenly we're in something that for the reader is infinitely more recognizable in capitalism. So that allows so much more leeway in terms of the story, because a lot of it I can take as, you know, you guys got this as readers. You understand this stuff because we're living in it. So that gives me so much more freedom to actually play around and have some fun with that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting what you said about the role of environment in the evolution of culture as well. And I'm sure that's true for every part of the Malazan world that you created. So yeah, interesting. AP, what do you want to say about Midnight Tides?
Well, I know that we've discussed this very recently. So I'm trying not to retread a lot of the stuff that we talked about.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I thought was very interesting, you mentioned this idea of the importance of the brothers. And when we talked about it, someone actually pointed out in my comments section that, we forgot to talk about the brothers who are guarding Tehol, that the identical triplets.
Yeah.
That, this is a recurring thing. Or the Garen Ebrecht and his brother who he had killed and is using as an undead guard.
Yes.
There's a lot of that going on, which is very, very interesting. But obviously, this is one of those books where the idea of compassion and the fact that compassion is not without cost, either for a society or for the individual. Compassion is not necessarily not going to cost you something, and we saw the cost to Itkovia. This has already been explored. But when Rulad is lying, effectively almost dismembered, where he's been deboned like a chicken, and lying there helpless, the compassion of the Guardian coming up to put him out of his misery, and of course that damns everyone. That one moment of compassion damns everyone. And the enormous cost to that. When we see the Troll's decision to go back to the throne room, and we know what that leads to because we saw that in the prologue of House of Chains, that he couldn't leave his brother, that love, that compassion, that understanding that he now had for his younger brother. And yet we see the direct consequence. We saw the direct consequence of that one book previously. And it recasts a lot of his storyline in House of Chains in entirely different light, as you suddenly come to understand who this character is and what went on. So there's a lot there about, those aspects. Yeah. But the idea of family and found family, the idea of individual betrayal, cultural betrayal, the fact that is something a betrayal if it is done for the right reasons, that betrayal as a concept quite often depends on your perspective. And the contrasting example would be justice. Justice is in the eye of the beholder, and it's when you see two parties going into court and one of them loses. The person who loses very rarely is going to come out of court and go, well, justice was done today, wasn't it, ladies and gentlemen? I lost. Justice is the person who won. Yes, God was on my side. Right was on my side. Justice was served. That's what justice is. Betrayal is the same. When you stand up to someone and say, I will no longer do that, they can look at you and go, you have betrayed me. Whereas depending on where the perspective of the narrative is whether or not it is betrayal or whether or not it is heroism. Right. And I think that that's like a really interesting aspect of this story, that when we start unpicking that, when we start delving into that idea of justice, that idea of betrayal, that idea of being honorable, the idea of being right, all of these things are never as straightforward as we think. Because who's the most honorable of the Sengar brothers? Who do you think? Is it Fear, the weapon master, the war leader who's protecting them all, who's training them all, who lives his entire life according to this, never stepping beyond the lines that are clearly demarked in his society? Is he the most honorable one because he does everything right, despite the fact his little brother is a shit, and despite the fact that his little brother is flirting with his fiancée, and despite the fact that he does have these concerns about the Warlock King, but he still adheres to what's going on? Is that honorable? Or is it Troll? Troll, who questions everything, who keeps going up to that line and going, is that where the line really should be? And is then bringing to, if you pardon the pun, shade on his family, that they are looked at without the true reverence that they should have, because Trull is slightly suspect. He's always bringing doubt to these things when he shouldn't. But we, looking at his questions, we looking at what he is investigating, go, no, but he is doing the right thing. So is that honorable to do the right thing, even when your society says it's wrong? Or is it Rulad? Rulad, who suffers all of these things, and all he needs is the understanding and compassion of his family to help him, and they betray him. He's a victim of this. He's being manipulated by Hanan Mosag. He's being manipulated by the Crippled God. He is being tortured by this demonic, evil sword. And he's been forced into this position. And when he looks to his brothers for help, they betray him. So he unites his people under a single emperor, under someone who can lead them. And is that not honorable? When Hanan Mosag deploys the most deplorable, disgusting, depraved magic to wipe people out and destroy them, this rain of blood and bones and magical energy that strips away life without a care in front of it, and Rulad stops it, is that not honorable? Is that not good? None of these things are simple. And that's what I love, this complexity of looking at the characters that have been created, the situations that have been created, and how it makes us think about them, how it makes us reevaluate them from these different perspectives. Because I've just been talking about the Sengar brothers. Now I think about them as Breeze thinks about them, or as Tehal thinks about them.
And
that he, when they see the Taste Eater, they have a completely different perspective.
Yeah. Interesting, the relationship between betrayal and honor, and there's even self-betrayal in there. For example, Fear, whom we learn near the end, had all these doubts that he simply suppressed out of this feeling of duty, or maybe he was a coward on some level. But he actually admired, we learn, his brother Troll for voicing the doubts that he, for whatever reason, couldn't voice, and in a sense, he betrayed himself. One of my favorite characters in here is Saren Pedic, and she sabotages herself for certain, and that has a lot to do with the patterns that we were talking about before, and this is a personal pattern of hers, and we see it in her relationship with Hull, and which didn't work out too well, and the ways in which she hurts herself, and that scene that you and AP dissected so effectively when she attempts after and these are big time spoilers to everyone here, after
way past that,
we're way past that. What's his name, the Pale, Baruch the Pale, who Saren did not admit to herself when he was around, certain truths about him, that he was probably in love with her and that he takes his own life, and then later she realizes that, and this overwhelming guilt is what a big part of what motivates her afterwards, to attempt to take her own life. And that very, very powerful scene that you two took apart is just and finally the intervention that happens, because you have Iron Bars there, and because you have Corlo. Iron Bars first prevents her from taking her own life, but then Corlo also teaches her how to interrupt the pattern. He teaches her awareness, ostensibly, and we commented, AP, on how this is one of the most clear explanations of Warren's in the entire series, and you worked that in there really nicely.
Took my time though.
Yeah. So he explains to her how it all works, and it's a beautiful scene. It's absolutely a peaceful scene somehow as well. The resolution in a way of her finally finding a way to break her patterns. So you can betray yourself too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Or even the notion of betrayal can be entirely misunderstanding, with Udanas, for example, and Rulad at the end.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. when they think he's run away, but he hasn't. And that has a lot to do with, again, these narratives that we tell. I mean, the Taist Idor are in the process of conquering the Laveri, and so they have to tell themselves certain things, that these are the other, these are animals, these are monsters, right? And so that's the default interpretation of Udinas's actions there, in the same way that they come across Tehol, who's trying to help Mayen in that scene where she takes her own life, and the warriors who had come to find her misinterpret that scene.
Well, certainly everything was structured for a very sort of Shakespearean bloodbath at the end there.
Yep, it definitely worked out. So wonderful. Anything else to add to our discussion of themes from the first 5 books of the Malazan Book of the Fallen?
No, I'm kind of okay. I mean, what's happened, of course, is by this point, all of the settings have been laid out at this point. And I think there might be some new characters that show up later on, but the primary storyline has been set and is now in place. But I mean, Midnight Tide's very, I knew it was going to be divisive, but mind you, by that point, I remember when House of Chains first came out, nobody liked the ending at all, you know, and it often got, you know, it was of the you know, in terms of listing the first 4 books, it was at the bottom of the heap each and every time, and it took a while for it to sort of come around. So by that point, I was kind of used to that. And I knew that Midnight Tides was just going to really throw everybody. But it was the most effortless in terms of writing of all the books. And I don't know why that was the case, but it felt very nicely self-contained as a story.
Yeah, certainly the feedback that AP and I have gotten in our discussions of Midnight Tides has been overwhelming. It's the number of people who've said, this is my favorite book in the series. Quite a few, actually. So I think it long-term, it has worked out pretty well.
Yeah, well, but that seemed to be the pattern, is that when the new book came out, when they were actually coming out, quite often the commentary would be, this is I like this one the least of them so far. You know, it was just almost as if there's this expectation that the series would fall off in some sense or another, you know, which happens to series. I think authors can become exhausted by their own, you know, the own world that they've created. So I just sort of, got used to that, you know, the books, if there was going to be any kind of change of mind, it was going to take a while for the books to sink in, I think.
Well, it's almost as if
you're heading for the Bone Hunters now, aren't you? The sixth one, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I've recently described as 2 novels slammed together. So, and it was the only way. It's funny because it was the only way I could keep with the 10-book series was actually to slam 2 books together at this point. Because anyway.
Well, it's long enough to be 2 novels slammed together.
The majority of these books are long enough to be 2 novels.
Yeah.
Oh, stop complaining, AP.
They're excellent value for money. You think it's a 10-book series? It's actually about 20 books. Well, one of the points I was going to make is Midnight Tides, this idea of these dark waters that underlie everything. The House of Chains, this idea of both the literal idea of what's going on in the story world, but this idea of the chains that we build for ourselves, and the chain of dogs, and all of these sort of symbolic meanings playing through, and all having points of connection to earlier books, having points of connection to these first 5 books, are, no matter when they occur or what the setting is, they are all joined together. That what is a constant surprise, I think, to readers about this series, because on a first read, you go, oh, it's a new setting and it's new characters and this is so different and it's not the same structure and it's not all of these differences. It can be easy to overlook the fact that there are all of these points of connection, that a lot of the differences are superficial is the wrong word. The surface level details are different, but there are thematic connections. There are structural connections. There are all of these narrative connections that join all of this together. And book 5 really, as Steve just said, is the introduction of this new setting and some of the characters and themes that are going to play into all of this. That we have our new arena, and we now are starting to put the pieces together. And it's not that the bits weren't there. It's now we're seeing how things are going to start fitting together. It's not that the story starts here. I've seen this on the Malazan Reddit, that people go, oh yeah, book 5 or book 6 is where the story starts. No, all of these other elements are where the story starts. That it starts then, but it's at this point when readers, particularly on a first time through, can see how it is actually starting to fit together. And it's a slightly different way of looking at it. But sometimes I think on a first time through, we overemphasize the literal details and do not pay enough attention to the subtextual information, the thematic information, the symbolic and metaphorical, that all of those actually are creating a seamless picture. And one of the ways to think about it is, if you think of a whole load of each book being like a complex 3D model, and they're all being plonked down next to each other, and you go, these all appear random. But when you get to a certain point and you shine the light on it, you see the play of shadows because they are 3D shapes, and it creates a giant picture behind the 3D models. And you go, you've been spending so much time looking at these individual models and the details on the individual models. You've missed this giant image created by looking at it from this perspective. Wow. And it's that play with narrative perspective that it's why I think these books actually endure and sustain multiple readings.
Well, one of the main challenges for me was knowing that the Crippled God, this is not really a spoiler since the last book's called The Crippled God, is actually one of the central threads in terms of motivation for the series, is the introduction of the Crippled God. If I introduced the Crippled God in the prologue of Gardens of the Moon, your classic fantasy prologue of the chained god, in the center of the mountain, and announcing its desire to destroy the world or conquer it or whatever. That would fit with your classic epic fantasy format, but obviously I didn't want to do that. So it was always a question of, well, as I was sort of outlining the books, where am I going to, wedge the Crippled God into this storyline, into this plot line, and to what extent do I want to actually put any focus on it? And I think the closest, Gardens of the Moon had very little of the Crippled God. I don't know if Crippled God's mentioned. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there is. Yes, there is some presence of it.
There's some presence, yeah. And of course, Deadhouse Gates is probably in discussion and conversation, etc. Some elements with Iskar Pust, I think, that kind of stuff. But again, I held off. And then I think Memories of Ice is where we first sort of meet the Crippled God, isn't it? Yeah. But again, a pretty small scene. One regarding Quickben, I think, more than anything else. And House of Chains, that's where the first offers are being made, if you will, to mortals.
Well, remember, Memories of Ice, we also have that scene with the artist at the very beginning who has made the cards. So you did drop in stuff like that, but as you go forward, it becomes more explicit and uh, more detailed.
Yeah.
But again, always you maintain a lot of ambiguity about it, and this is one of those very common criticisms of the series, is that you are obtuse and mysterious for the sake of just being mysterious. It is a criticism or a complaint that I have leveled at you.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and the thing is, once you get into the habit of it, it just becomes second nature. But if you think about it, the two main threads, the Crippled God and Tavor, are handled in parallel fashion, right?
Huh.
In that respect,
with little hints in the beginning.
little hints, yeah.
But
I know.
I will say here on camera, I was wrong to complain about that, you being obtuse for the sake of being obtuse, or being vague for the sake of being vague. Yes, there are small moments that still cause me frustration because I want to know more and I want to know explicitly. But looking at it now, particularly on this read that I'm doing with Philip, I value those moments because it gives me a greater sense of verisimilitude about the world. It gives this greater sense of authenticity. It also allows me as a reader narrative space to create my own vision of it, that I'm not being dictated to about this is exactly the thing, that there is flexibility and space within the narrative, these little moments of ambiguity that allow me to tailor the narrative and create my own unique individual picture. And I think there's a lot of bravery in that for an author to place that level of trust in a reader.
Yeah.
So, and it is something I greatly enjoy with this text, that it is not didactic, it is not laid out explicitly that it must be X, Y, and Z, that you have left me space as a reader to create my own narrative experience from it.
Yeah.
That may have been a natural consequence of me leaving space for Cam, now that I think about it. Because it's a co-created world, isn't it? And so sometimes I remember being specifically vague because I wasn't sure regarding Cam's take on something, and I wanted to leave it as vague as possible so that if he was going to be writing something about that, he'd have the room to move around and give us sort of, I mean, Cam's great gift, even I remember back in gaming, was just to completely blindside me with the same information that I had in front of me. He would just deliver it in a twist on it that I never saw coming. And so I think now that I think about it, it may just be a very mundane, explanation for why there's so much ambiguity. I was leaving the door open for Cam.
You're supposed to say how it was just your genius intent from the beginning, or something like that. But yeah.
Listen, authorial intent is unimportant. So, ignoring everything that he's just said, for me as a reader, regardless of why it happened, it is one of those things that I enjoy about the text.
Yeah, I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah. It does sort of. It's maybe what makes the series unique, the fact that it is a co-created thing.
Yes.
And that it was born out of basically dialogue between two people, for the most part. And of course, each of us, we bring our own sensibilities to it. Yeah, we've shared some things. We certainly shared a lot of experiences on digs and other aspects of our lives. But we've also deviated, quite dramatically in terms of where our lives took us. And the only point of real connection right now is the Malazan world. So that's how we maintain our dialogue, if you will. Even though we're living 1,000 miles apart or whatever, it's maintained through the books, and that kind of makes it fun, because then, like you say, or like I just said, you have to leave those doors. You can't close any doors. You can't lock anything away. You have to sort of leave it open, because especially now with Cam doing the Path to Ascendancy and the second trilogy, this is all formative stuff, and so it's yeah, I can't, I certainly can't produce anything now that's actually going to mess up that forces him to retcon something that he's writing right now. So,
wow. Yeah, I would just, from my experience, I would say that the way from the outside, at least, the way it appears is that the way that you and Ian Esselmont created all of these characters together lends a certain organicness to the relationships between the characters that I really enjoy. And just everyone talks about the duos in the Malazan world and how wonderful and how vivid the relationships are between the characters. So that is definitely a hallmark of the series that makes it one of the things that really does make it special. So,
and it's interesting because then if you think, well, when I think back to the gaming, even though we're creating these fictional characters and we're writing up the stats for them and all the rest and giving them names and functions and professions and skills and talents and all the rest, the unspoken premise in bringing the two characters together, is that they're going to either become friends or adversaries or a combination of both, because Cam and I were friends. So that's almost, it sort of slips into these characters almost. And I love the way Cam had to sort of deconstruct that when it came to Dancer and Wu and Kellenbed.
Yeah.
Because, he had to show that initial meeting where, the reader knows that they're going to become friends, but initially there's, he's got to get them to that point. And so it's really amusing to see the sheer levels of frustration that Dancer's going through.
Yeah, especially when
good fun.
How Kellenbed gets his name as well. And
yeah.
It's so funny.
But one of the points just coming from this, where you talk about it being this organic, one of the fascinating things about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I'm not going to include Esselmont's work in this just for this one point, but it's a 10-book series. There's a very definite arc. There's a very definite series of thematic connections and all these things that we've been discussing. But because of its organic nature, because of the complexity of the world, there's a messiness to it. And something that we see particularly in trilogies or series or these extended fantasy narratives, an expectation that everything will be neatly tied up in the main thread, or that everything will always be neatly tied up as you go along. And if you take a step back from that expectation and look at it, you go, but that's incredibly artificial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we see that in film, when we read it in narrative, it can be very satisfying because we get this enormous sense of closure from seeing the endings of all of these things and seeing them come together. That gives us that satisfaction of closure. But when you think about it as a big, sprawling, open world, the fact that there are aspects that are open-ended, the fact that, as we know, certain characters and storylines are continued or explored in Esselmont's work. Certain things that happen in Esselmont's work have repercussions for the Malazan Book of the Fallen. There's interplay between them. So when people say, oh, but this doesn't go anywhere, you go, well, it goes somewhere in the world, not necessarily where the Malazan Book of the Fallen is going as a narrative. And that organic nature, that messiness, that deliberately crafted organicness to it, where not everything is cleanly sliced off or cleanly tied up, gives it that sense of feeling more real. And it's always going to be a balance between the artificial nature of narrative, because narrative is artificial, and trying to create an experience. And we so often fall into take it with show don't tell. Erikson loves using show don't tell, but this scene he tells, and you go, it's not a binary that it must be all or nothing. There's always a give and take. There is a tension between these polarities, these dyads, these binaries. there's always going to be movement between them, and certain sections are going to be more narrative and artificial, and certain sections are going to be more organic and verisimilitudinous. There's always going to be that movement between the two. But what we get through the exploration is a general sense of it. And I think we see that in each of these 5 books. They are individual novels.
Yes.
When you look at them, there are aspects of them that you go, yes, this is a standalone narrative within the novel. Is the whole novel a standalone? There, you would get significantly less out of it if you read it solely as a standalone. But you could still read any of the first 5 novels as a standalone. It just would be more difficult, and you wouldn't enjoy it as much, I don't think. But the narrative arcs that are developed within it have closure within it. They do function according to that narrative structure. But with these books, each one is different. Each one focuses on a slightly different aspect and builds on the others. And that's it was just a point that I wanted to bring up about this.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be certainly more relevant when you get to Crackpot Trail, won't
it? Oh, I'm looking forward to that.
Have you read it? Have you
I haven't read it yet. I haven't read it.
I haven't read it.
Not yet. I am going to read it soon. Yeah.
Oh dear.
I've read it.
I've been savoring just the idea of reading it. It's like I'm opening a really nice bottle of wine or something. I'm waiting for it. So, and Ruth and Bad and I are going to be sure to give AP a little bit of a hard time about it. So we'll see.
Have you read other Bokale Corporal Brooch novellas?
Yeah, so we read the first 3. We did the first 3, AP and Ruth and Bad and I, and each of us hosted one of the first 3. Yep. And so we're going to do the second 3. We're doing them by the 2 collected novellas, I guess. So yeah, we're going to do the same deal. And AP, we decided it would only be fair to have him host Crackpot Trail. So.
The joy.
Yeah, that is the most meta thing I've ever written. And it's also a recursive kind of Mobius loop everywhere on just all kinds of ridiculous levels. But it also, it discusses the relationship of author and audience.
And critic.
And critic, yeah. Yeah, the critic. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, perhaps on that note, we should wrap it up. I am so grateful to you, Steve, for being here for this discussion. This is wonderful. Thank you for writing these beautiful, beautiful books. And
well, thank you for reading them.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. I'm just learning so much. And AP, thank you for reading these books with me. This experience has been so enriching. So just, I've enjoyed myself so thoroughly. I can't actually think back on another reading experience like this. And you are a big part of why I'm enjoying this so much. I look forward to our discussions immensely. So thank you both. And perhaps Steve, you'll come back again when we're finishing the series. That would be wonderful to have you back for that. So AP, I will see you very soon for another Malazan. Actually, Stonewielder, I think we're going to do before the next Bokale and Corporal Brooch books. So yeah, we've got some good stuff coming up. So thank you both, guys.
Thank you.
And we'll talk soon.